And at that time, it was incredibly hard to voice certain things. So certain things were just swept under the carpet. And what you realize is by sweeping things under the carpet doesn't make it go away, it just makes it quiet. And that's sometimes the most dangerous thing of all, when things are happening, but they're happening in silence and people can't seek help or support for them. So I decided, how do we have, so then I moved to Kenya and I realized on this continent, we have a very similar issue. There are so many things that we know happen that we sweep under the carpet and it doesn't make them go away, it makes them louder in fact and more dangerous. So I thought, what can I do in respect of my grandmother's memory to do my bit to try and ensure that that doesn't happen to someone else? So the reason why I'm telling you this is please understand the spirit behind this. The spirit behind this is an opportunity in a safe environment for people to come together to talk and to voice. The reason why there are men, women, young, old, black, white, Muslim, Christian, Jewish in one room is we want every opinion here. And there is no such thing as a bad opinion or a wrong opinion. And please, I beg of you, if someone says something that to you is incredibly controversial, don't do we don't say that here, because that's against the spirit of why we're here together today. We're here just to have an open, clean space for people to voice and for people to challenge. And please, if you're challenging, challenge with respect and intellect, because everyone in this room is intellectual and has the ability to challenge things intellectually. #RedCorner254 and @ParkinNairobi. Awesome. Okay, so the first subtopic we're going to talk about is, does culture play a role in sexual consent? We can start with you.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much. This is an amazing collection of people, and I think it's a good start. Culture plays a very big role, in my opinion, because even the definition of consent really comes from a very cultural view. In Africa, for instance, or at least in Kenya, what I know is when people pay dowry, that is consent. It's actually consent for everything, which, that's in the situation of marriage. So if you imagine that sexual relations are put in the context of marital relationships, then you would say that culture sets the stage for married people to imagine that consent is blanket as soon as that dowry is paid. Now, whether that's right or wrong is a whole different discussion, but then I think that it has a role to play. And of course, I'm not the author of all cultures, so I cannot say what all cultures say, but I do know that some cultures in Kenya do agree that consent is blanket. And so I think that's a good controversial place to begin about what culture does in terms of granting consent.
Good evening, everyone. Culture, in the olden days, men and women were taught differently. And our grandmothers and our mothers taught us that we should have these feminine virtues, that you should be chaste, you should be, how will I keep it? You should just be obedient. When you're in marriage, you have to respect the husband. Whatever he says, you have to go with the flow. But in this case, we are moving from that past cultures and we're getting into the modern world, right? Therefore, we have to say what we want. We have to mean what we say. And also, we have to teach our girls that when you want to do something to me, you have to ask me first. You don't have the right to just mishandle me however you would like it to. You don't have that right. So we also have to teach our girls to ask. And, most of the times, our culture is always like, when a boy or a man becomes rude to you or is bad to you, he just likes you and he's just playing hard to get. But no, that is not the case. We should not teach our girls that when a man is being violent or being rude, and that it's okay to do that. It's giving them the power to enhance their ego, and that is not correct. To me, that is absolutely not correct.
Yes. Nicole?
So I think before we talk about consent and culture, we also need to talk about how culture views women, because that defines how consent is being defined for mostly against women. And so if we look at culture, we see how various cultures around the world always subjugate women. So for example, in my culture, in the Chinese practice, foot binding has been done for over 1,000 years and was recently abolished just in 1912, which is the practice of breaking a young girl's foot to make her foot smaller and therefore more sexually desired because they have a smaller foot. Strange, right? Then you have in Kenyan culture, we have FGM, right? Then we have in other African cultures, all of these other ritual to make the girl child more sexually viable for what? Marriage, right? For that dowry, for money, for whatever it is. And we look at Middle Eastern cultures, right? Where if women do not conform to a specific societal standard, they will be murdered in the name of honor killings. So therefore, because you do not bring honor to the family, we, the family, have the authority to kill you, right? And so this is how culture is viewing women all around the world. And so that negative, or actually very low view of women that culture often plays is what defines consent, or even doesn't even define consent, where consent is not even an option for a culture that debases women.
All right, thank you. Good evening. So when we're talking about consent, we're actually also with the assumption that someone is making a request and the other party has a right to either accept or refuse. And within the context of sexual consent, culture is fundamental because first of all, they ask. In most traditional African cultures, I'm not going to walk up to a woman to say, I want to have sex with you. I'm going to undertake certain steps, buy her a gift, make certain overtures, which she should then interpret, and she's then expected to respond to me in a particular way. Not yes, not no, but I should be able to read the body language, which is part of the prevailing environment. And so, for example, I know cultures in Africa where the word yes or no does not exist in their lexicon at all. That's when you look at Ibarapa culture of southwest Nigeria. So when you ask them, have you eaten? When he says, it appears so, it means yes. If it says, I'm not sure, it means no. But in reality, nothing is absolute. Some people haven't eaten until they've eaten pounded yam, even if it's eating bread. And so the point about it is, the ask itself. And so if a guy in those prevailing cultures was to walk up to a woman to say, I want to have sex with you, he'd probably be kicked out of the village that day because that communication is not acceptable. So it impacts on the ask, it impacts on the other side as well. So culture is fundamental to whatever kind of discourse we're going to have.
Does anyone on the panel want to challenge anything anyone else on the panel has said? Go on.
You know, we've heard about the fact that culture also places women at a disadvantage. Definitely, if you look at the SDGs, we're trying to read the furthest behind. But in some African cultures, the prevailing African culture also puts a lot of demand on the man. I must see the woman, I must approach, I must woo, I must spend money, I must make effort, I must be rejected, I must move to the next woman, I must earn my skills, I must sharpen my tendencies, and I must pay the bills. And so it's not just enough for me to go around carrying a pair of testes. I must also have the resources to go along with it to make me a man. That's a huge burden to carry.
I have not a challenge as such, but a question. Although that might be true, is that the same as sexual consent? Because there's difference between the burdens that place on the man and the burdens placed on the woman: shopping, cleaning, bearing children, looking after those children, still going to work in 2017, cooking, make sure your man is sexually satisfied, all of those things. When it comes to those things, how relevant are they to consent? Because in this culture, a lot of burden is placed on relationships, for sure. Be you a man or be you a woman. My question is about consent and the role culture plays on consent.
Because culture defines the way we relate with ourselves. I once had a colleague who was in her 50s and she already had 2 kids in their 20s. And she said, you know, to me, every night, if my husband was to reach out to me, I first refuse. I am not socialized to wake him up to say, hey man, I think I want it. That day, I go home. Because culture still fundamentally defines consent, even on both sides. And that's what we have to continue to talk about in the light of the challenges we face.
To the panel, first of all, but then the audience, you're welcome to weigh in. would you say that culture overwhelmingly has a positive impact on consent or a negative one? Or 50-50?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that I don't want to be fatalistic and say it's negative completely, because culture is also dynamic. And I think what Jerry was trying to say when she was making her comments was that no matter how our culture has been, we can also kind of transform and become dynamic and say our culture has been a certain way, but it can also be another way. Now, let me come from my psychological perspective. Sometimes I think it's better to do that. When I teach my students at USIU where I teach, I try to tell them that, it's very easy to become emotive when you get a subject like this because of someone you know it's happened to, or someone you think it's going to happen to, or it's happening to. But the reality is that culture can overwhelmingly overwhelm decisions that people make. According to what the doctor has said about the pressures on men, I don't think it's an excuse, but it's a way to look at it and frame. Look at this guy who's been dating 6 girls, right? Like, let me just give you that as an example. He spent so much money, he's tried to do everything with them, then eventually all of them have let him down. On that Saturday night when he goes out and he's buying the 7th girl drinks, on that day, I don't know about his psychological state. I'm not excusing him, neither am I saying it's okay, but I'm trying to say that probably that girl is going to be paying the sins of all the other 6 girls, which a psychological burden for me. I think that that's a problem in of itself, but he's trying to pay back to people who actually didn't owe him anything, and that's what the real problem for me is. So culture does set the stage for that disappointment when it comes to consent. The problem is that we're living in 3 cultures right now in Africa. You have the pre-colonial, colonial, you have the post-colonial, then you have the post-modern. Kenyans, you have millennials who don't know whatever happened in Kenya a long time ago or culturally. So when you're talking about it to Jerry's generation, then you're talking to my generation, then you're talking to my parents' generation, those are 3 different people you're talking to. So I think that culture has to be addressed from the point of where is the person, where are they going, and where they come from, for us to actually really understand what consent will look like for them.
At this point, I want to hand it out to the audience. Does anyone in the audience have anything pressing that they'd like to challenge or add or say? You just need to do this.